Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. الصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So, continuing with our very, very cursory and very, very swift survey of fiqh, we are going today onto ibadat, onto rituals. So we're going to cover some key ideas, key concepts, and then briefly, very quickly go over the key discussions, what we discuss when we cover a book of fiqh on ibadat, on acts of worship. So today we want to talk about form and meaning, certain recurrent principles and concepts, the concept of purity, prayer, zakah, fasting, and hajj. So we will not be going through the details of any of these things. Again, in the readings, we get the book Al-Fiqh al-Madhahib al-Arba' Islamic Jurisprudence according to the four schools. It's there in the reading list. We can read them. This is not a formal discussion of fiqh itself. This is an overview of it. So it gives a general idea, what would we study in fiqh, right? But I cannot go through all the details of wudu and prayer and everything. If we have time at the end, I will be more than happy to answer any questions if anybody has any, and if I'm able to answer them. But we would just want to go over general ideas and general concepts. Okay, so form and meaning. Form and meaning. So if we recall, the ultimate goal of the sacred law is the letter of the law, is the spirit of the law. The ultimate goal of the letter of the law is the spirit of the law. Okay, the spirit of the law. What is the spirit of the law? A heart filled with love and awe of Allah. That is the whole point. That we should exist, our being, whether in this life or in the next, we are like those angels standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what we are. In all scenarios of our life, our heart is continually with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in hope and in fear, in love and in awe. Continually turning to Allah. That's the whole point of our existence. That's the whole point of our existence. That's the whole point of the sacred law. So the point of this structure that we spoke about last week, the whole point about it is that core. Okay, what does core mean? Does anybody know what the word core means? When we say the core of something.
Most basic.
Of the word core is cœur in French, the heart of something, right? The core of something literally means the heart of something. So what is the heart of Islam? This, the heart of all these, of the court and the Sharia and the Hajj punishments and the prayer and the adhan and the wudu and the this and the that and all these different rites and rituals, is that centerpiece, the core of it, the cœur, right? The very heart of it, right? That heart, that's the whole point. That is the meaning that the letter spells. The Sharia, it all spells out this. This is the whole point of everything. And so if we recall again from last week, the spirit of the law was very, very important. We said it was essential, and without it, there was no religion. It's pointless, but it is very vague. It's observable, but it is vague and not measurable. Okay, so this is a concept that we're going to reiterate today, and we're going to say the inner spiritual state, the state of heart that is created by the rituals and empowered and strengthened by the rituals of prostrating to God, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of washing away your sins in wudu, of washing away one's avarice with zakah, of washing away the dunya from one's heart in the fasting, of leaving everything for the sake of Allah in a hajj, going around Allah again and again and again throughout your life in the tawaf. These are all spiritual things. So the inner spiritual state, that's the point of it. That's the point of it. But it needs, because every single meaning, every single concept, every single conceptual thing needs something physical for it to be realized in. You cannot have generosity without people. Without a rich person and a poor person, there is no such thing as generosity. Right? Without scarcity, there's no such thing as being generous. You need to have a form. You need to have some kind of way that it manifests itself. And so it is essential to have this thing. But this thing cannot exist. The inner spiritual state cannot exist without an external expression of it. You can't have communism, for example, without money, without workers, without people. If there's no actual thing, then where is the concept? Right? You can't have red without a thing that is red. Right? And so we have the meaning is extremely important, but it cannot exist without a form. It cannot exist without a form. So there is great need for meaning. Form without meaning is pointless. It's meaningless. You put water on your face, the dog puts water on his face. What's the difference? Nothing. You put your head on the floor, someone's drunk, they put their head on the floor, they pass out. What's the difference? Right? Someone travels from one place to the other place and walks around a building. What does it mean? If it has no meaning, if it has nothing, if there's no heart within inside it, it's meaningless. But if there is no form, it can't exist. You cannot have that thing without a form. Right? So this is very, very important. Right? This is very, very important. The form is extremely important, right? So that's why we have rituals. Rituals is not just the spiritual state that's free and expressed in any way, but there's particular forms of expressing and forms of encouraging and kindling this inner meaning. Okay, this is what we mean by rites or rituals. Right? As opposed to being something completely free. Express it however you will. Right? So if we look at Christianity, for example, in comparison, right? In comparison, we can see to a great extent, many of the ideas in Christianity is a completely breaking away from form. There's no Sharia. It's just the meaning, just altruism and these kind of things. Agape love, loving your brother. That's it. That's the only rule for many Christians. And so they often then, Christians over time, have created forms, have created rites and rituals to reflect things, but otherwise they're created. In Islam, that's very different, and none of these forms, none of the formal acts of worship are created, right? If something is an act of worship is created, we call it what? We call it a bid'ah. A bid'ah is an act of worship that did not exist at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So that's a very important thing. Our forms are, the meaning is from revelation, is from Allah, and the form is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the same time, there is a danger, the form itself and the overemphasis of the form and obsession with the form and over kind of getting too held up with the form can kill the meaning. So we have to have both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law cannot exist without the letter of the law. And the letter of the law without the spirit of the law is meaningless, is pointless. Okay. And so, forgive my cultural references, and I don't mean to be a kind of a Kung Fu fan here, but Bruce Lee, many of you might be very familiar with the name Bruce Lee, Kung Fu films, great, so flying kicks, etc. Bruce Lee is not just a philosopher himself, but he's also coming from an Eastern mind. He's coming from an Eastern mind. And so whether they like it or not, any real Kung Fu film has to ultimately have some meaning to it, And so if, for example, you watch the film, many of you watched it many years ago, I don't know if it was in the 70s or whenever it was, Enter the Dragon, right? Very famous Bruce Lee film. He's in the beginning, he's training one of his disciples, etc. It's a very spiritual thing. The martial arts are spiritual, right? They're spiritual things and they help us understand things. So anyway, right at the end, he has this fight with the big baddie, and he's in a maze of mirrors. So there's images everywhere. So what is the problem with a mirror? Is that you see something, but that thing is not there. You see something, but the thing is not there. Okay, like the dunya. You see a beautiful sun, but that's not our creator. Beautiful moon, but that's not this, but that's not that. Everything points to Allah, but is not Allah. The ayat we see in the dunya, we see the ayat of Allah. We don't see Allah. Okay, and that's what the mirror is like. So, and what does he do anyway? So he's fighting this baddie, and this whatever guy's got a claw hand and keeps cutting him up because he can't see because everything looks the same. And he remembers something that his teacher taught him, which is that the enemy just has images. And if you destroy the images, you will destroy the enemy. Right, what is that? Breaking the form. Breaking the form. And so this is a cool idea that Westerners can kind of just about understand, but you can imagine, again, many people of the East, this idea of form, spirituality is just, and meaning is very, very important. And that's why you have martial arts. Part of the martial arts is attaining a something deep, but through a form, right? And so, but we see here the idea of breaking the form. In another one of his films, Bruce Lee similarly does that. So it's called Game of Death, one of his films, and it's quite an artistic film because he's fighting people on different levels of a pagoda, and he fights level to level to level, and he gets to the top. Anyway, the point is, Bruce Lee throughout this film, and the reason why he wins is that he is able, if you notice, for example, here, he's wearing this kind of like sports suit. He's broken the form. He's not wearing, for example, a karate gi or whatever it is, any kind of traditional thing. He's broken the form. He's broken the form. And through breaking the form, he managed to beat, for example, traditional martial artists, right, in different levels. And then right at the top, he fights Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is almost challenging him in breaking the form, because here we suddenly have somebody who's wearing shorts, he's sitting down, and it's very, very difficult for Bruce Lee to fight him, but eventually he breaks the form and wins. This is a recurrent idea in many spiritual systems, and it's a very key idea, right? Key concept of breaking the form. Similarly, we have it in the Western tradition with the Romanticism, the idea of breaking the form. Okay, Romanticism, reaction to, or maybe secondary reaction to classicism, right? All about form and keeping things very rigid. And we have the Romantic languages breaking away from Latin, breaking away from things, and the need to break away from the idea of the city and the laws, etc., with the Romanticism. And there is a lot of things in Romanticism that we would agree with. We wouldn't agree with Romanticism in an absolute sense, but there's many ideas and themes that resonate with Islam, and hence the book here, Islam and Romanticism. It's not an amazing book, but it's all right. It's good. By Jeffrey Einboden, Muslim Currents from Goethe to Emerson. There was a clear resonance between Romanticism and Islam, but it's slightly different. So the idea of breaking form is very important, but you can't destroy the form. If there's no form, then there's no, then we have failure. And hence that's why our criticism as Muslims, our criticism of Christianity would be, it is the letter, it is the spirit without the form, right? Another example of this is the idea of anarchism in Islam. So Islam is not an anarchistic religion, but there are ideas of anarchism within it, and we particularly see that, for example, right in the beginning with the Khawarijites, right? The idea of absolute morality, and everybody has to be fought against who are not absolutely right, breaking that away. These are ideas coming out. We hear this phrase of the Sufis, khal al-ivar, throwing off all shame, breaking out of something, right? The wording dervishing is a bit like that. There is form, clearly, right? There's form and rhythm, etc. But again, like breaking out of something, right? Breaking out. And so this is an extremely important concept, right? Keeping the form, but breaking out of the form. Keeping the form, but breaking out of the form, right? And this is one of the difficult things in Islam, is meeting of opposites. So we can apply Islam on a deficient level, and it's not that difficult, right? You can just be completely outward or not be outward at all. Don't even abide by the Sharia at all. Apply one thing on the other thing. But when we apply Islam in a 100% way, we are applying always meeting of opposites. The Prophet ﷺ at the weakest time of his life is raised to the highest of the heights, right? And countless times we see this. The Prophet ﷺ said, you become strong by forgiving other people. The opposites, right? It's always the opposites. You help somebody by stopping them harm themselves, by stopping them sin, for example. So this idea of being in and out, we are neither, for example, completely spiritual nor completely formal, but rather we're spiritually formal and formally spiritual, if that makes sense. Meeting of these two opposites, right? And again, we find various expressions of this. For example, Jalaluddin Rumi's flute, right? How he begins the Masnawi. How does he begin the Masnawi? The story of the flute. So where is the flute from? Well, the flute is from the reed bed, from the river, right? It's a reed, and it's complaining of the fact that it was once in the river and now it's out. And so how can it complain of being away when it hasn't left its origin? And how can it realize that love and yearning for its origin if it's not away? And we have this very profound word in Arabic, which again reflects this this meeting of opposites. Bain. Bain means separation. It means separation, right? This idea of being apart from something. Bani yabinu means to separate. Bani yabinu also means to become clear, right? And so these are some of these deep words. It comes just naturally in the language because of that, the relationship with these two words. But the joining of opposites, how something has to be away for it to become close. Ibn al-Farid, not Farid, right? Farid with a dad, he's expressing the feeling of being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, clearness of water with no water, the gentleness of the breeze with no breeze, right? It's something that cannot be expressed. And so this is the importance. So meaning the spiritual reality of every single thing is extremely important, but it has to have the form. And those are the rituals, the ritual purity, the ritual this, the ritual that. Okay. Is this all clear to everybody? Is it making sense? If anyone has any questions, you can ask.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Sister Abida, Rizwan, Atif.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Abida.
Okay. So please feel free to stop me at any time. Okay. So that is the constant, this continual conflict of form and meaning. And this is something we discuss, for example, in literature, in linguistics, we talk about it. I'm sure it's a fundamental thing to do with a fundamental problem in mathematics and in computer programming ultimately, and not ultimately, but subsequently rather. And of course, the thing in art, right? You have the meaning of the art and the form of the art and the relationship between those two, form and meaning. Okay, so now key principles and concepts. So key principles and concepts in ibadat. So number one, ibadat, we mentioned last week that sometimes there are things in the bigger picture of the Sharia that are not really moral. By moral, we don't mean good or bad, but they're not really to do with an individual, right? Sometimes, for example, it can be, your car, I don't know, something happened with a minor, for example, a child, and there could be repercussions. There could be moral repercussions of something that is not moral to begin with. It was in a moral action, right? We mentioned that particularly when it comes to court. But when we talk about ibadat, when we're talking about wudu and prayer and zakah and fasting, we're always going to talk about your intention, right? Because it's all about your heart. It's all about your heart. And the idea of things being amoral are fairly irrelevant. In fact, it's impossible to have an amoral act of worship. So if you didn't know about revelation and you weren't more responsible, you couldn't have a valid prayer and a valid Hajj and a valid anything because you're not more responsible. There is no moral connection between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? If so, there's there's nothing for that. So we're always going to talk about you knowing about Islam and accepting Islam and then intending to do this and intending to do that. I'm going to ask you what your intention was. What was your intention? Innamal a'malu binniyat. Actions are owned by intentions, which is a stark difference to, for example, contracts. When, for example, in a marriage contract, your intention is fairly irrelevant. In fact, it is irrelevant. So if you say, I hereby marry my charge to so-and-so, done. It doesn't matter if you intended to, did you intend to marry them or not? Did you intend to do this? It's irrelevant, right? Your intentions are not intentions irrelevant in a contract, for example. It doesn't matter what your intention is, unless we need to look at your intention to understand the language. For example, the language might be vague. We might have to look at the intention, maybe, sometimes. But by default, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant, right? But when we're talking about wudu, when we're talking about prayer, it's all about your intention. It's all about your intention, right? And so by default, every single thing they're all deeply moral actions, and it's all going to be about your intention and what did you know, what did you not do. It's all about your heart. Okay, that's what it's all going to be about, right? It's not going to be about something else. It's not going to be about what someone else did or what someone else happened, etc. Sometimes we're going to deal with what we call ahkam shar'iyya wad'iyya. Ahkam shar'iyya wad'iyya. These are signs. So for example, is it good or bad that the sun set? I mean, it's not a moral action, isn't it? There's no one intended to the sun. I mean, is it a good or bad action? I don't know. I mean, but now you have to pray. So it doesn't really matter whether or not it's a good or bad action in itself, but it is a sign that you have to pray. Or for example, is it good or bad to have the zakat amount for a whole year? It's not really, not really this or that, but it is a sign of you having to do something now. Is it good or bad that you broke wudu? It's not really an action unless you intended. It's not really an action that you intended to do. So it's not really a moral issue. But the issue is you are pure, you're not pure. Your hands are pure, your hands are not pure. This food is pure, it's not pure. This liquid is pure, not pure. It's a sign of what you could do with it, what you couldn't do with it, right? So it's part of these signs are part of, so to speak, the forgive my ignorance of computer programming, but part of the actual hardware of how things work, right? The hardware of how things work, the signs that tell you to do other things. But generally speaking, we're not going to be looking at these things. For example, a contract itself is a moral thing because you did choose to do it, right? Generally, but you may not, and you may not have any intention, etc. But they are generally, for example, the fact and the enacting of a contract is a sign of the validity of the contract, which then means that the repercussions can go forward of that contract, right? And so we're going to talk about these things. So generally speaking, we talk about moral actions. Is it good or bad? And signs, has this thing happened? Has this thing not happened? And is, for example, an act of worship valid or invalid? There's also a sign. So for example, the fact that your prayer was invalid means that you have to repeat it. It's a sign. Whether or not you intentionally made it invalid or not, something else, right? So these are signs. But generally speaking, we're going to be focusing on morality, your morality. And hence, there will be certain things that will stem from that. So for example, I just skip ahead here. For example, the idea that someone, if you were ignorant of something, you forgot something, or you were coerced into something. So again, if it's a purely moral issue, if you forget about something, then that's going to be relevant, because the fact that piece of information was in your head or wasn't affects the moral decision you make. And you could still be morally good even though you make a mistake, right? Because you just didn't know about something, right? You might forget something, right? And so you can still be morally sinless or sinful based on what's aware in your head, or if you're coerced into something, right? Whereas generally, for example, in contracts, it's not very relevant, right? We'll talk about, for example, what if you are coerced into murder? What if you're coerced into murder? What are the repercussions of that? You obviously you were forced, so you have a choice, but but what are the repercussions in front of the court? Might be different. As they say, what was the principle in law? They say, the ignorance is not an excuse, right? If you're ignorant of the law, it doesn't matter, right? It's irrelevant. So and that's often the case in Sharia as well. The fact that you didn't know, so you knew that drinking was forbidden, but you didn't know that there was a punishment for drinking. That doesn't matter. Or you forgot. You forgot that there was a punishment for zina. It doesn't really matter. It's irrelevant. Whereas in ibadat, it's usually going to be relevant. So the fact that you forgot, that means you're not guilty anymore, not morally guilty anymore. So it will often have repercussions. Another thing is because it's between purely you and Allah most of the time, right? Zakat, for example, might be an exception, right? With zakat, it might be an exception. Otherwise, because it's between you and Allah most of the time, there's always this kind of ease in it. In acts of worship, there's always this tendency to just make things easier, right? With acts of worship, as opposed to when you're dealing with somebody else, it's not, right? So we will find scenarios where difficulty will bring out ease in contracts, but that's because there is an ease for both sides, but not for one side, right? Otherwise, it's a push-pull relationship in contracts. And so just because it's difficult for one person or easier for another person, we're not going to budge because, making life easier for one person might make it harder for somebody else. So we're not going to do that. But in ibadat, because it's between you and Allah, when things get difficulty, we're going to see that things become easy, right? So these are some things that are kind of somewhat, I'll just give an example of ignorance, right? So I didn't know, I'm trying to give an example. I didn't know, I didn't know something, so it's excused. Yeah, so according to many ulama, I'll give this example, according to many ulama, I didn't know I had filth on me. So I had some, for example, vomit all over my knee, and I didn't know that, okay? Allahu Akbar, I pray. I give salams and I realize the vomit is there. And obviously it's been there since the beginning or before, I don't know when exactly, right? So morally, have I done anything wrong? Have I sinned by praying with vomit on my knee? No, of course not, because I didn't know about it. Okay, does it have repercussions on the prayer? Yes and no. This is a debate, right? But many of the ulama, they would say no, because you didn't know. You didn't know, okay? Now let's compare that to another scenario. I steal my father's car and I sell it to Atif. Okay, I sell it to Atif. I needed some cash. Okay, and so I sold it for cheap because I wanted to do it quickly. The next day, I realized my father had died 2 minutes before I sold the car, and the car was actually already my property. So in my mind, I was sinfully stealing someone's car. In my mind, I was sinfully selling someone else's car. But that doesn't matter, because the reality of the case was that it was your car. It doesn't matter. So your intention, that's to do with your sin, is it in no sin? It has nothing to do with the validity of the contract. So the fact that you thought you were selling a car that wasn't yours does not affect the contract. And you've sold a car that you could have sold for much more because you were stealing it and trying to get cash immediately, for example. And so the point is, we're not looking usually in financial transactions, court cases, these kind of things, we're not really looking at morality. We're looking at, did he say this? Did he say that? Did this happen? Did that happen? That's what we're usually going to look at, right? Whereas in acts of worship, it's all about your heart and Allah by default. Yes, there are certain rituals that could be affected, but otherwise it's all moral. So basically, if you're a good guy, your worship's fine. That's the default, right? There are many exceptions, but if you are a good guy and you try your best, it's usually fine. Okay, so these are so there's many principles we can talk about, but again, just a kind of overview. So difficulty brings about ease, right? Again, that's something we find throughout the Sharia, but we're particularly going to find it in ibadat way more than in mu'amalat or in financial transactions, these kind of things, because again, you're dealing with Allah. Number two, we're going to say, because it's a moral issue, the fact that you're not aware of something, you forgot something, you're coerced, for example, into something, it's going to be excused usually. It may not be. There are some limiting factors there as well. A principle that's applied again throughout Islamic law is the default is assumed, right? Al-yaqeen la yazulu bi-shakk. Certainty shall not be lifted by doubt. So we'll see this throughout. So this is something that applies throughout in inheritance. Your dad disappears and your uncle dies. Does your father and uncle inherit your father, who may or may not be alive? Does he inherit from your uncle? What's the default? Is he still alive? Is he not still alive, etc.? Okay. default scenarios, assuming default scenarios. What was the default in the contract? What was the default in the marriage? What was the default in this? Doubt, for example, was it a threefold divorce or twofold divorce? Well, the default is 2 because that's the shared number, for example. These things will come throughout, right? But it comes in ibadat all the time, in acts of worship all the time. Certainty is not lifted by doubt. There's a default setting. We don't depart from that default setting until something else happens that we're certain about. And then something else which is more, again, relevant, because, again, we're talking about morality. We're talking about morality. We're talking about rites and rituals, right? Rites and rituals. That prohibition, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet sallallahu, Allah through the Prophet sallallahu, prohibits something, it will usually mean that's invalid. And we'll explain what that means, inshallah, shortly. So let's go through one by one. Difficulty brings about ease. Some scenarios. For example, the fact that a small amount of filth is excused, right? So the rule would be, when you pray, you have to be pure. Okay, well, there's many scenarios in life where you can have filth and it's excused, because it's difficult to avoid all filth all the time in all amounts, right? So that's difficulty. Tayammum, it's difficult to get water everywhere. So I'm going to travel through the desert, drink my water, and make tayammum. Dry ablution, that's fine. Right? Difficulty, etc. Joining or shortening prayers, right? The fact that you're traveling, it's harder to pray a certain amount, to pray on time, etc. So there's the concept of joining prayers and shortening prayers, right? Changing the prayer time, merging prayers, etc. These kind of things. Shortening prayers. This is about the difficulty brings ease, right? Clear scenarios. Eating forgetfully, it's quite hard to remember that you're fasting all the time, right? And so the fact that, okay, you didn't really fast because in the middle of the day you ate some food. Yeah, but I did it forgetfully, and it's difficult to remember. Right? So this will be irrelevant when you're dealing with other people. Oh, I forgot to pay my rent. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, it's okay in that you're not sinful, but it's not okay. You do still own the money, right? Whereas here, for example, it's just overlooked. Right? It's overlooked. Everybody gets the Arafah wrong, right? So Arafah is supposed to be the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. In Saudi, they got the day wrong, and then everybody was on Arafah on the wrong day. We're going to ask the whole ummah to come back next year? That's difficult, right? So in principle, they got the day wrong. Like you come to the end of the Hijjah and it's only 28 days. Well, you got the day wrong, didn't you? You stood at Arafah on the wrong day. So you have not done Hajj. Yeah, but that's very difficult. That would be very, very difficult if you asked everybody to do that. Right? The deen is not that hard. Right? And this is a general principle. Whenever you find that the way that you're washing, the way that you're praying, the way that you're doing your Hajj, it just seems incredibly difficult. Like only a superhuman could actually do what you're asking me to do. It means the deen doesn't ask me to do that. Right? So you should go and ask a scholar, say, is it really this strict? Is it really that hard? For example, I'm on Hajj and I'm a woman. A woman on Hajj, you can't cover your face, but you also have to cover your head. So I have to cover everything. I have to expose all of my face, and I also can't cover anything more than my face. So what do? I have a kind of like a surgery that I go to a cosmetic surgeon to staple a hijab right exactly on that imaginary line between my face and not my face. How do I do that? That would be impossible. So Sharia says, you know what, don't worry about it. Just cover a little bit of your face and you'll be fine. So you make sure you cover everything other than your face, and the rest is, because you're not asking to do things that are impossible. Right? You're not asking to do things that are impossible. Other scenarios like this, for example, the fact that difficulty when you're washing your face. Okay, I've got a beard on. I have a beard. Okay, well, how am I supposed to get water underneath my beard every single time? That would be difficult, right? Whereas when you make ghusl, you are expected to, because it's not difficult. Most people aren't making ghusl 5 times a day, right? Right? But people are making wudu 5 times a day. It does happen. So it's quite difficult to ask me to make sure I wash right inside. Wearing khufs, for example, another ease. There's countless scenarios like this. You don't need to elaborate every single one, but there's countless scenarios like this. Ignorance, forgetfulness, and coercion. Right? The fact that you are la yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wusaha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't ask you to do things you can't do. If you have forgotten something, you are not more responsible for that. So I'm standing there in the prayer and I'm honest to God, I can't remember the Fatiha. I'm sorry. What do you want me to do? I just can't remember the Fatiha. What, am I sinful? No. I forgot, for example, to do my second tashahhud. I forgot something. I mistakenly did things. I was coerced. Gunpoint, I had to eat. Someone said, break your fast, right? So by default, all of these things are overlooked. By default, when you're ignorant of something, it's overlooked. You didn't know about it, it's overlooked. If you forgot something, it's overlooked. If you're coerced into it, it's overlooked by default, right? So for example, guessing the Qibla, I don't know where the Qibla is. Well, am I sinful for not knowing the Qibla is? No. So you're going to do ijtihad, you're going to look here, look there, and make an estimation, right? And your prayer is going to be fine, because what else are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to know something that you can't know? It's impossible, right? Breaking wudu in prayer. So according to many scholars, not majority, but many scholars, for example, if you unintentionally break wudu in the prayer, you go and make wudu and complete the prayer. You don't have to start from scratch. Why? Because you didn't do it on purpose. Right? Speaking in prayer. I didn't know I couldn't speak in prayer. Right? That's what happened. A Sahabi came back from Abyssinia, and he was new. He had gone on the hijrah to Abyssinia, and he came back, and when he left, everyone was speaking in the prayer, and he didn't know that. So he comes back and he's speaking to people in the prayer, and he doesn't know what's going on, and everyone's looking at him funny. And the Prophet said, "Hey, you can't speak in the prayer." So, oh, I didn't know that. Did you have to repeat the prayer? No, you don't, because you didn't know that. Right? It's overlooked. You didn't know that. Praying with filth on clothes when unaware. So again, according to many scholars, you pray and you have filth on you. I wasn't aware of that. Okay, so well, you're excused them because you didn't know. You didn't know that, according to many ulama. Not losing water. Right? Losing water. I had water and I lost it somewhere in this car. I don't know where it is. Right? Scenarios like that. Eating under coercion. So again, gun point to your head, break your fast or I'll shoot you. It doesn't actually break your fast. Right? It doesn't break your fast. Breaking fast on a journey. That's not really, so that's really under the previous category. I apologize, I put that under the previous category. Breaking fast on a journey is under the previous category of difficulty and ease, right? Same kind of thing. Stepping on a perfumed floor. So you're on Hajj, okay, and you're in Ihram, and you can't put any perfume on. But what do they do in the Haram in Mecca? They wash the floor with this nice perfume. So then you step on it. Whoops. Yeah, well, you didn't mean to do that, did you? Did you mean to put perfume on your foot? No. Okay, so it's going to be excused then because you didn't mean to do it. So we would all agree that morally, if you didn't know something, or if you forgot something, or you were coerced, you're not more responsible 95% of the time. And a good percent of the time, I'd say 70% of the time, also the fact that you're ignorant of something, the fact that you didn't know something, the fact that you were coerced, means you're excused. It doesn't affect the prayer, it doesn't affect the zakat, it doesn't affect anything because you were coerced. Right? It's not it wasn't within your capability, and we're dealing with a purely moral issue, right? A purely moral issue. And so again, compare that to dealings with other people. So under coercion, for example, under coercion, you broke someone's car. Someone's put a gun to your head and said, break Farid's car window, or I'll shoot you. So then you did. You broke my window. Okay, you still have to pay me, right? Whereas for Allah, you don't have to pay Allah, do you? Under coercion, it's overlooked. That's it. You didn't mean to. It's overlooked. Right? That's the default. Now, there are a number of exceptions. For example, if things are uncommon. For example, in the Shafi'i school, they say, okay, what if I was praying and somebody pushed me away from the Qibla? Okay, well, that's coercion. Yeah, but does that happen very often? No. Then it's not excused then, because it's so rare. It's such a rare thing to do, right? Whereas if you forgot that you were praying and turned away from the Qibla, then you would be excused because that's considered to be more common, right? So sometimes things are uncommon. If it's not common, it's, or you were ignorant of something. It's like, how were you ignorant that eating broke your fast? How old are you? 40. Where did you grow up? Pakistan. You grew up in a Muslim area? Yeah, I grew up in Pakistan, in a Muslim area in Pakistan. And you're 40 and you honestly thought you could eat in Ramadan? How? So that's extremely rare. That's extremely odd. So you're not morally responsible, but it does break your fast because that's odd. That's so weird, right? And so simply if it's kind of mixed, like you're excused, not excused. So for example, you knew about the filth on your trousers and then you forgot it, right? So that's not the same as you didn't know in the begin with, right? You knew you had water in your van somewhere, but now you can't find it. Well, it's kind of like, is that arguably they kind of your fault, because there's a level of taqsir, you kind of fell short there, right? It's kind of your fault, right? And there'll be scenarios like that where there's a kind of it's mixed. It's not complete ignorance. It's ignorance, but there's some level of shortcoming, forgetfulness, some level of coercion, kind of mixed. For example, it doesn't really apply to the different scenario. So when you're not really 100% excused, sometimes it will still affect the prayer or the other things, right? So that usually the thing that mitigates it. So the fact that, for example, it's very difficult. This same thing would apply in reality to difficulty brings about ease, because difficulty and coercion are kind of similar concepts. So, for example, they say that, getting flies out of water is very difficult to avoid. Wherever there's water, there's going to be flies. Flies like leave eggs, lay eggs in water. It's kind of a common thing they would do. So it'd be very difficult to ask you to not have dead flies in any water anywhere. And every single time you had a large amount of water to kind of keep it away from flies, that's quite hard throughout the world, right? It's quite hard throughout the world. Because what if I threw dead flies into water? Say, well, not really excused then, are you? Because you kind of caused it yourself, right? And we'll see debates like that, where generally it's kind of mitigated by the fact that it's not so common, or it's not really excused. Similarly, if it involves other people's rights, right? If it involves other people's rights, then it wouldn't be excused, as we mentioned before. Or inviolable matters. So we'll see that, for example, in zakah, right? You forgot to pay zakah. Do you still have to pay it? Do you still have to pay it? Of course you have to pay it. Right? Of course. Under coercion, for example, you gave some zakat money away that was supposed to be given to the poor. Well, that's someone else's rights, right? It's something else. Inviolable matters, for example, on Hajj. So we'll see some things on Hajj that will be treated as inviolable. So, for example, in the Shafi'i school, we'll say that putting perfume on is excused if you didn't know about it, if you forgot about it, etc. But for example, cutting a nail was not. Why? Because it's considered an inviolable place. This is the sacred place, the sacred time. You cannot, in a sacred state, you're in pilgrim sanctity. Cutting nails in this place, even if it was done forgetfully, even if it was done unintentionally, even if it was done with an excuse, still calls for expiation, because it's about the sanctity of the place. It's an inviolable place. So it's different, right? It's almost like dealing with somebody's rights. You accidentally drove into a gazelle. Okay, well, are you sinful for driving into a gazelle while on Hajj or while in Ihram? No. Did you intend to hunt? No. Okay, so I'm not sinful, true. Okay, but do you have to expiate? Yes. Well, why? Because this is a sacred place. And at the end of the day, a game animal was killed, its life was taken. This is a sacred place, you're going to have to expiate, right? So there are some things that mitigate, some exceptions to these rules. Any questions so far?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Fahima.
Where do we draw the line as consistently saying that I didn't know that versus making an effort to at least learn the basic in worship?
Exactly. That's where we say is that where is the level of taqsir, of falling short? Okay, so for example, I'll give you an example in the Shafi'i school. So I became Muslim right now, and I'm just an English normal guy, just became Muslim. I don't know the Fajr or anything. So how am I supposed to pray? You say, well, read from this piece of paper. Okay. Alhamdulillah. And I can't pronounce it properly. I don't know what a ha is. I don't know what a sad is. I don't know any of these things. So in the Shafi'i school, you have to pronounce it correctly. If you do not pronounce the Fatiha correctly, the prayer is not valid. You have to pronounce a sad correctly. You have to pronounce a ha correctly. That's it. That's the prayer. That's the form of the prayer. Okay, well, how do you expect me to do that? I've just become Muslim now. I don't even know Arabic or anything. I'm reading from transliteration. So we would say in this scenario, say, Farid, you just became Muslim now, right? Okay, fine. So next week, how long have you been Muslim? A week. Do you know any Muslims? No. Do you know any kind of websites? Anybody who might teach you anything? No, I don't have any access. Okay. 2 years later, Farid, have you been to the mosque? Yeah, many times. Has anybody offered you tajweed lessons? Anything? Yeah, many times. Have you taken those? Nope. So now what's going to happen is we're going to say, Farid, hey, 2 years ago, you were excused because you couldn't do what you were asked to do. Now, you had the chance, but you didn't do it. So in the Shafi'i school, what we'll actually say is your prayer isn't valid. The fact that you can't recite the prayer properly is not an excuse because you had the chance, you didn't take it. So now your prayer is going to be invalid. You're going to have to learn. You're going to have to make up those prayers that you did during that time because there's a taqsir, you fell short, right? That's just the Shafi'i school. Right? That's just a Shafi'i school. There may be other positions, other schools, for example, that are more lenient. But that's just as an example, right? And an example, right? Similarly, when we say you weren't aware of a basic thing of, you weren't aware, for example, of the fact that you couldn't drink while fasting. Fine, on your first day. You just became Muslim and you say fasting, meaning not eating, right? That's what we understand as fasting. A medical fast, usually you can drink water, usually, right? But you've been fasting in Mecca. You've been living in Mecca for the last 15 years and you don't know that? That's odd. That's strange. We wouldn't excuse that, right? And becomes an issue of, again, as you mentioned, come on, I mean, you should have known that by now, right? That doesn't make sense, right? And even if honestly you're just dim, right? Like you just didn't notice things, even that we would still say, hey, I mean, morally fine, that's between you and Allah, but at the end of the day, you're gonna have to make up these fast or whatever it is, because this is just ridiculous, right? This is too much, right? And so when you don't have a genuine excuse, yeah, things could, and sometimes it will be mixed. It's not really clear, and we'll have a debate. You'll see a debate within the same school about these issues, right? So for example, that I mentioned, if you didn't know you had filth on your knee, is it excused or not? Yes or no? Okay, you knew it was there and then you forgot about it. More likely no, because there's a level of taqsir. You should have remembered that. Yeah, you're excused because at the end of the day you didn't know. There's an argument there, but at the same time you did know that it was there to begin with. So it's quite different to just being purely ignorant. This is, you were ignorant of the fact, you weren't really ignorant of the fact, you forgot the fact. It's different, right? And so, yes, these issues will come in. But at the end of the day, morally, between you and Allah, if you forget something, you are not responsible morally. There might be repercussions in that act of worship, true, but morally it's not. Right? Because you just don't know something. You cannot be asked to know something you don't know. You cannot be asked to remember something you can't remember. Simple as that. Right? So, me or you as a person, I might be annoyed, like, hey, why did you forget? Like, I'm annoyed with the way you deal with somebody, but at the end of the day, if you just forgot, you forgot. Like, you don't know something. You cannot be, they mention morally speaking, it is logically impossible, logically, psychologically, religiously impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ask you to do something you don't remember. It's impossible because you don't know it. Simple as that. Right? Wallahu alam. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Jazakallah khair.
Okay, so another thing about the default, for example, doubts.
So I have a question as well.
Go ahead, Atif. Go ahead.
So this is about the contract. If you go to Costco and you buy something, you get basically a return policy.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear about people who, when there's a big game coming or something major happening, they'll go buy big TVs. They'll come watch the game, and then next day return it.
Mm-hmm.
Or when the game is over, return it back and say, oh, we don't want it. And Costco has no ask policy.
Yeah.
So as Muslims, the question becomes that, is this purchase even valid? Because if you intended to return it after watching the game, was your purchase even a valid contract?
So that's not really to do about today's topic. I'll answer it briefly, but yes. So basically, listen, if they so usually returns are going to be returned because of a defect, return because you stipulated, I want 3 days to decide. What else? Return could be some other things as well. But if they honestly do that, we wouldn't actually label it as a return, right? In many of these scenarios, it's not really a return. What it is an actual resale. They've just said, listen, we've agreed to sell it back to you. So the problem there is if it doesn't technically fit under one of our categories of return policy, okay, then by default, and again, it's not a fatwa, but by default is we would see it as a promise to sell back, which you can't do in principle, right? Which you can't do in principle. So I cannot, for example, sell you something which is 2 sales in one. You can't do things like that usually. So you can't say, for example, I'm going to sell you this car, and this will, by selling you this car, this will give me the right to buy your phone from you. You can't do that. So when you sell something to somebody and this gives them the right to sell back, usually that's kind of problematic, right? It is problematic, right? But at the end of the day, Allahu A'lam, Allahu A'lam, in a scenario like that, as long as you are frank, like you say, listen, you ask them, am I allowed to bring it back tomorrow? No questions asked. They say yes. Thank you very much. And buy it and bring it back. And that's it. So is it Islamic? No. Because the spirit, the spirit of it is that they are trying to give you the opportunity to judge something, right? And you're just buying it for that. So it's not Islamic. Is it halal? It's going to be halal because that's what they said. Right? I didn't deceive them in any way. I said, so honestly, tomorrow, I want to buy it to watch the game tomorrow. And I want to bring it back afterwards. Is that cool? And they're like, it's up to you, bro. I don't mind. And like, okay, thank you. Then I'll do it, right? And as long as you're frank, right, then it's not haram, right? As long as you're not hiding information that affects their rights, that's all. Is it Islamic? No, it's not, right? Because it's not. Does that answer your question?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so default. So for example, in purity, okay, right now my desk, I come into my house, okay, I have to put a prayer mat down. Why do you have to put a prayer mat down? Well, because najis everywhere. Why is it najis everywhere? What is the default assumption of the whole universe? Pure. Okay, thank you very much. So you can pray wherever you want. Pray any ground. Go to any place. The default assumption is pure. The water, the tap, I might have filth in it. No, the default is pure. Maybe I need to make wudu. Well, did you make wudu 2 minutes ago? Yeah. Did you pass wind or something? Maybe. Ignore that. Ignore maybe. We go on certainty. So the default assumption that every single thing around you is pure. The default is that when you wake up in the morning, you don't have wudu. So you can't pray until you make wudu. The default after making wudu is that you do have wudu, right? So you ignore any doubts and you base on certainty. Whatever you're certain about, that's what we go on, right? So doubts about wudu. Did you break your wudu? Did you not break your wudu? Right? Well, I still have wudu. Doubts, for example, the default before you finish your wudu is you don't have wudu. So now I'm doubting, did I wash my arm? Did I not wash my arm? So what's the default? Did you wash your arm or not? The default is you didn't, right? So therefore you have to wash your arm again. Once you finish making wudu, what is the default? Is that you've made wudu. Okay, well, I'm doubting now whether or not I wash my whole arm. Well, the default is wudu is valid. So therefore you don't have to question that, right? Similarly, the default, it's makruh, for example, in the Shafi'i school, to wash your arms less than 3 times, and it's makruh to wash it more than 3 times. So what do? I want to do the sunnah, and I don't want to do makruh. So what do? I can't remember how many times to wash my arm. Okay, what's the default? It could have been 3 or it could have been 2. Or the default is 2 is the bare minimum. So wash it another time, for example. Doubts after prayer, right? Was my prayer valid or not? Did I do the Fatiha or not? Have you finished a prayer? Yes. What's the default on a prayer? That is valid or invalid? That is valid. Okay, then khalas, end of story. Okay, what about inside the prayer? I'm not sure I'm not sure if I did my Fatiha or not. Okay, well then you didn't. Because the default is you didn't. Right? Doubts after prayer, as I mentioned. Doubts about the prayer time. The default, I'm not sure. Is it Isha time or not? I don't know. Okay, therefore it's not Isha time yet. Right? The default is it's not Isha until it comes in. So you can't pray until you are certain or nigh certain that it's the prayer time. Okay, has Isha ended or not? I don't know. I'm not sure. Well, therefore it's still Isha time, right? So for example, Ibn Abbas, for example, he was there. He was blind at the end of his life. So he's with two men. And he's having them look for the sun for Fajr. So the one of them says it's Fajr time. The other one says no, it's not. So he says, there we go. You doubt. I'll have another drink of water then, or whatever he was drinking, right? So the fact that he wasn't sure, is it Fajr or not, that means it's still Isha, right? Because I'm not sure. There's two calculations. One says 57, one says 56. Well, the default is it's still the time. And that's not being very precautious, but at the end of the day, the default is the prayer remains until you know that it ends, right? The onset of menses. So if Fajr came in and then you started menstruating, then you're going to have to make up Fajr. But if Fajr came in after you started menstruating, they're not going to have to make up Fajr because you couldn't pray in Fajr time. Okay, well, I can't remember now. I'm not sure. Did menstruation start before or after Fajr? Okay, what's the default? The default is that everything goes to its latest possible time. So it's possible that it was before Fajr and it's possible it's after Fajr. So therefore, you're going to assume it's after. Because the default is anything happens in the... so it's possible that it happened 2 minutes ago, and it's possible it happened 3 minutes ago, and it's possible it happened 4 minutes ago. So what is the agreed upon default? 1 minute ago. Okay, so therefore it's there. Doubt, I just prayed. 5 minutes after praying, I see filth on my knee. Okay, is it possible that filth was before the prayer? Yes. Is it possible that it was during the prayer? Yes. It's possible it's after prayer? Yes. Okay, what's the default? The default is everything is to the last possible time. It happened just now, if that's possible, for example. Doubt about traveling. Have I gone traveling distance or not? I'm not sure. Okay, well, you can't shorten then, can you? Right. I'm not sure if I'm going traveling distance, can I break my fast? Not sure. You can't do that. Right. Right. So the default comes in all the time. What is the default? How many times have you gone around the Kaaba? I'm not sure. Okay, it's either 5 or 6. Then assume 5 because that's the default, etc. So we're going to be doing this countless amount of times in all over fiqh. What is the default? What is the default? What is the default? What is the default? All the time, and we're going to base on what is the default, and it comes up all the time. Okay, and sometimes there will be things that mitigate it. For example, that if we were to, for example, you are not certain that it is Maghrib, so how can you break your fast? You can actually break your fast if you are nigh certain. Why? Because it's difficult to be certain. Right? So there's two principles coming in at once. The default is you haven't washed your arm, and your arm means your whole arm. So if you are not certain you wash your whole arm, then you haven't washed your arm. You say, yeah, but it's quite difficult to get someone to know that they washed their whole arm, every single speck. So we're going to say no, as long as you're kind of confident, it's fine. Why? We're going to go against the default because it's difficult otherwise. Right? So there could be, and this is genuine when fiqh becomes difficult, as we mentioned last week, conflict of principles. Okay, prohibition. So prohibition. So when we're talking about worship as we are now, right, when we're talking about worship as we are now, prayer, zakah, fasting, etc. Worship is a kind of, it's something that's called from Allah, right? Allah is calling for it. And so it is not valid if Allah doesn't call for it. So if Allah doesn't ask you to do something, it's not going to be valid, right? If Allah doesn't ask you to do something, it's not going to be valid. So for example, if I invent an act of worship, it's not going to be accepted by Allah because that's not what He asked you to do. You can't do that, right? We mentioned in the beginning the bid'ah, concept of bid'ah, right? Inventing a totally new type of worship is you can't do that. It's not called for. You can't create a new, I don't know, fifth pillar or something. Okay. Type. So worship is only valid, only counts if it's called for. Okay. So therefore, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids us to worship in a certain way, that means the act of worship is not called for. So if it is forbidden, right, and is not called for, therefore not valid. It doesn't count. Right? It does not count. So when you pray, when you give zakah, when you fast, and you do Hajj in a way that Allah doesn't want you to do it, it's not going to be valid. Right? It's not going to be valid. Now, is that absolutely the case that if something is bad, it doesn't count? It's not always the case. So for example, making wudu, right? You make wudu, you put water on your face, etc. That's a valid act of worship, right? So it's an act of worship that Allah calls for. An act of worship that Allah calls for. When you go to pray, you make wudu. So I beat somebody up, steal their water, and make wudu. So the wudu suddenly has two sides. It's an obligatory act of worship that Allah is asking me and requiring me to do. And at the same time, every single act of that process is also sinful because this water is not mine. Right? This water is not mine. Okay? And so, is that valid? Like if I made wudu with stolen water, it's haram and obligatory at the same time. How can it, is it called for? Did Allah ask me to do this action? So is it valid or not? So the majority of the ulama say, well, it is valid. It does count, right? It does count because it's wudu at the end of the day. The fact that it's with stolen water is just one of the many ways that you could wrong somebody. So the majority of the ulama, they'll do the following thing. They'll say, look at this thing that's forbidden. The forbidden aspect about this action, what is it? Well, using somebody's water without their permission, right? Using somebody's water, water without their permission. Okay, could you drink their water? Yeah. Could you pour their water away? Yeah. So using somebody's water without their permission could be done in wudu and outside of wudu. So it's really kind of just tangential. It's just happened to be that, you know, the two things happen to coincide. There's nothing essentially wrong with the wudu. So the majority of the ulama would say, no, this wudu is valid, even though it's prohibited, right? Similarly, prayer on stolen land, same scenario. You put your head on the ground, you are sinful for putting your head on the ground. You're sinful for standing on that property because you're not allowed to use that property. But at the same time, you're fulfilling an obligation. So how do we label this, right? How do we label this? Again, majority of ulama would say, if we can split it cleanly into two separate actions, right? التصرف بمال الغير, misappropriation of someone else's wealth as one side, and prayer on the other side, then we're going to say it's valid, albeit sinful, right? So there's obviously all sinful, but the issue is it valid, right? Hajj with ill-gotten gains, same thing, right? Someone's a drug lord and they go on Hajj. Okay, well, where's your money from? Or it's stolen, or whatever it is, right? Is that Hajj valid, right? And again, the majority of the ulama say it's valid. I mean, you did do all the rites of Hajj, so it counts as Hajj. What do you want to do? Is that accepted from you? It's not accepted from you, of course, but you know, that's something else. Similarly, for example, a sunnah fast without the permission of your husband, right? So fasting, because it not just affects food, but also affects conjugal rights, is not permissible, right? A sunnah fast is not permissible without the permission of your husband, right? If he doesn't mind, you know, doesn't mind, that's fine. But if he's like, no one have relations, you're like, no, I'm fasting. That's haram. You can't do that, right? And the Prophet mentioned that explicitly. Okay, so she fasts anyway. She's going to fast anyway. So is she sinful? She's sinful. Okay, is that fast valid? Does it count as a fast? And again, the majority of the ulama would say it's valid. Okay, but the Prophet said she can't do that. So that means surely the revelation is saying it doesn't count. Yeah, but revelation is saying that. But in reality, we can look at it in two things. Why is it sinful for a woman to fast without her husband's permissions? Because it mitigates his conjugal rights. Fine. Could she mitigate his conjugal rights in other ways? For example, she'd be like, yeah, I'm not interested. Get lost. Disappear. She could do anything, right? So the fast itself is not the thing. That's just one side of it. So again, we're going to cut it in half and say, this is one thing, not rendering his conjugal rights. The other thing is fasting. So it's going to be a valid but sinful fast, a valid but sinful Hajj, a valid but sinful prayer, a valid but sinful wudu, right? That's what we're going to do, according to majority of ulama. Some people would say it's invalid. Hajj.
I have a
Go
question
ahead,
about this.
Go ahead.
In this kind of relationship, is a woman stuck? She wants to do some extra prayer or something, and husband is not always ready for sex, but he says, oh, don't do it because I might. So is woman a equal partner or a slave?
That's a very deep question. We're going to be talking about this in maybe 3 or 4 lessons. No, it's not an issue about being a slave. It's an issue about what does Allah. So we have to understand that nobody exists.
Then let me repeat my question in a different way. Can husband fast, and if one doesn't want him to fast?
Okay, so here, so number one, let's answer your first question. So is she stuck? No. So she has to say that husband doesn't exist. I don't exist. Nobody exists apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Everything but else are just puppets around for her to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created her and gave her a husband that wants to have relations 24/7, and she wants to fast and she wants to recite Quran, and she's like, I have no idea what's wrong with this guy. Then what is she being told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? She's being told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I prefer that you do this over this. In which case, it doesn't matter. She's not, we don't worship fasting or worship Quran. We worship what Allah wants you to do, right? And so we have to abandon that, the idea that someone's there and say, what is it that this is a sign that this is what Allah wants me to do? Okay, that's the number one answer to that question. Now let's flip the coin. So now answering the thing about conjugal rights. Okay, it's like, okay, here is this guy who is always out, mashallah, giving da'wah, mashallah, always out praying, always out this, always out that, fasting during the day, this, and when it comes to her needs, it's not being met. So what do we say? We say that his obligation towards her, and it's not by agreement, but his obligation to her is to fulfill her needs, emotional and physical needs, emotional, physical, and financial needs, to the best of his ability. So if he honestly knows that this woman has a physical need, and for example, let's say he works during the night and he's home during the day, but he's fasting, mashallah, and he knows that's the case, and he noticed in her behavior, and not just that, in her voice, she said, I have a need, excuse me, hello, and he's just saying, I can't be bothered, then he is sinful, but the fast will be valid, just like her scenario, right? But it's slightly different. Why is it slightly different? Because
maybe can I understand what you're saying, and I have repeatedly heard, I'm an older woman. Can I say that maybe when Prophet ﷺ said the woman is sinful when she's fasting, if her husband doesn't allow, that the other scenario did not come in front of him. So isn't it in this day and age, scholars should say, any spouse who fasts without the permission or letting the other person, the other spouse know, is sinful, instead of just always putting.
It'll be limited to the.
I'm not changing the hadith, but what I'm saying is maybe at that time, the scenario what I'm asking did not come. So maybe that's why.
No, I think the scenario did exist. It did exist. There's nothing new like that.
No, I mean, but I never hear that a woman doesn't want her husband to fast and he fasts and he's a sinful. You also gave the scenario of he's going for dawah. Just go for the same exact example and say so both are sinful if the spouse is not willing.
Say it's clearly sinful, is where he could leave that sunnah fast or leave that sunnah thing that he's doing and fulfill her carnal needs, and he decides not to. That's when we say, well, what's wrong with you?
Okay, thank you.
What's wrong with you? Like, oh, because in reality, there's let's say, forget the fiqh side. It's like, there's a reason why he's doing that. It's like, yeah, you're just cold, you're fed up with your wife, you don't like this, getting back at her, whatever it is, there's something wrong with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so where's the difference though? Is that her rights are contingent on her need. So we would say, when is that his obligation is in keeping with her need, right? Whereas his carnal rights are not in connection with a need, right? So he, for example, he's like, yeah, do you want to do it again? And like, what's your problem? Like, you did it twice today. What's your problem? And so would we say, well, listen, this is a bit ridiculous. She's like, I want to do some Quran. I'm sorry, I want to do something else. This is stupid. No, we would say, no, it is a difference. There is a difference.
And even if there is a physical issue, that health issue?
That's of course the case, but she's saying she's not tired. She's not sick. She's just like, yeah, I don't want to do that. I'm sorry. Like, I'm not, that's what I would.
Are there different physical needs of men and women? So woman is obliged even if she is not interested?
All things being equal. So assuming she does not have any physical, it doesn't hurt her physically. It is not, she's not sick. She's not super tired. It's just, she does not in the mood what to talk. She's like, I'm sorry. That was very nice last night. I don't want to do it again. Thank you very much. And he's like, no, I want to do it again and again and again. And be like, yeah, that's okay. So that is a fundamental.
So man's mood count, woman mood does not count, because she has to then complain and say, oh, I'm really tired, or I have this thing. So she has to pretend. She cannot say that I'm not in mood.
And that's very important. There was actually
she has to lie.
No, she doesn't have to lie. She should voice it and say, excuse me, I am here. I am a woman. I have needs. and she should be very explicit about it. And if she is not heard, she should take means to go to a higher authority. And if it's a recurrent thing, she should not let her shyness and do that, right?
Thank
So
you.
genuinely, he's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I work 14 hours a day and I cannot. That's genuinely the case. Then we would not make him responsible. We say, actually, really, do you work 14 hours a day, or do you just spend a lot of time at work? And really, are you tired, or you're just not interested? So the point is, his responsibility is to fulfill his need, fulfill her needs, if he can, giving his ability, right?
Thank you.
And so if he then refuses to do something, he is sinful. He is sinful, and he has to answer before Allah. Okay. Whereas the difference is what? What if it's not a need on his side? It's just a want. Okay, then it still should be sinful for fasting, or still sinful for not complying, unless she had an excuse. She's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't slept for the last 2 days. Sorry, I'm really, really tired. Sorry, I have a million back pains. I have this. I'm sorry, I'm not interested. Right? That's something else. Right?
Isn't it a good spouse to
but also
automatically understand that?
Can I just add just one little thing? Sorry, just one.
Yes.
We have to put, remember last lesson, the tripartite thing we have to put in there is, there is the default halal haram. Again, you come up to me and I'm like, well, this is the answer. This is textbook 1, 2, 3, 5. The textbook answer, the legal answer, meaning the court, right? There's the court, there is the textbook answer, and there is the ihsan answer. So we have to put, when it comes down to it, the three things have to be in order, right? So even if he's desperate, and even this, and even this, and even this, that, one of the sheikhs saying is like, these kind of things don't happen in push and pull. Well, I demand it. Well, it's not going to work, is it? Demanding doesn't work. He comes up and reads the hadith. It's haram for you to fast, by the way. She's like, yeah, but right, it doesn't work like that. So we have to have ihsan. Right? And we have to see things in the bigger picture. So for her side, she's dealing with this guy who's really into it all the time. She has to worship Allah in that way. From his side, we're going to sit with him and say, hey, bro, think about what it means to be in a relationship. Think about the whole scenario. Think about X, Y, and Z. Why is it that your wife doesn't want to sleep with you? Why isn't it? It's like, well, is it normal like that? Is this? Be reasonable, right? And this is how relationships work. And people are reasonable, compassionate, care, etc. Right? Whereas somebody who's like, no, this is my right. It says it in the book. It's not going to work, right? It's not going to work. He's going to get a divorce, then he's going to get another divorce, and another divorce, and another divorce, because things don't work like that. Okay. But again, when you ask me a question, where am I putting it? Which answer am I giving? Right. The first answer, I'm giving it in the 2-dimensional thing. But then we put it in the 3-dimensional thing, it comes into something else. Okay. But again, inshallah, we'll talk about this. I think, in 2 or 3 lessons, inshallah.
Thank you. But I'm concerned about the young girls reverting to Islam. So we always emphasize that this comes like, if it is said in a way that it's more gentle for female, otherwise it's like, you understand what okay, thank you very much.
And I appreciate your your input. Jazakallah khair. Okay, so Hajj without permission of parents or creditors. For example, I'm in debt and I drive Uber, and the guy's like, okay, Farid, please pay up at the end of the month. I want you to be driving 6-7 days a week. You got to pay. I go on Hajj with no hope of money just flying out of nowhere. So I'm sinful. I was supposed to pay Atif at the end of the month, and I didn't, because I'm going on Hajj. MashaAllah, may Allah accept from you, but you're sinful. So every step you make, you're a sinful person. He does not forgive you, right? Or your parents, you've already gone on Hajj, and now you're going on Hajj again without the permission of your parents. Okay? You can't do this. You can't do that, right? And so you're sinful. Is it valid? Yes, but you're sinful, right? The same thing. Fasting on Eid, right? Fasting on Eid. So here, the majority of the scholars would say it's sinful and invalid to fast on Eid, right? So you made a vow to fast a day. You're scared that you're going to die, so you say, I'll just do on Eid. Nobody to celebrate with anyway. I'll just fast on Eid, not a big deal. I'll be used to fasting anyway. So we would all agree that it's sinful. You cannot fast on Eid. But is it valid? Is it valid? And so the majority of scholars, the Hanbalis, Shafi'is, and the Malikis would say, no, that's not valid, because it is not something you can cut in half. You cannot separate the sin of fasting on Eid from Eid. You can't. So the sin of going on Hajj without your parents' permission is the same as going to Barbados without your parents' permission. So you live with them, or you live near them, and you're going to travel away from them for no reason whatsoever. You're just going to go somewhere else in a way that risks your life, or a way that just leave them for no reason whatsoever, against their permission, for no benefit, worldly or religious. You're not going to study, you're not going to work. It's just, I'm just going. And they say, please don't go. Like, I'm asking you, like, don't go. And you say, no, I'm going to go anyway. So it's not Hajj specifically, it's just any way of harming your parents in that way. So here we can split with a Hajj scenario, with a creditor scenario, you can split it in two. Here you can't split it in two. How can you split it in two? Fasting on Eid and the sin of fasting, fasting and the sin of fasting, you can't split it in two. You cannot do the sin of fasting Eid without fasting. So for the majority of the ulama, who say it's invalid. For the Hanafi, say it's valid. Why? You fasted, right? It's a fast, right? And so the Hanafis will still be valid. Similarly, when we say prohibition, does that include what is offensive? So is the category offensive, is that a subcategory of permissible or a subcategory of forbidden? So for example, in the Shafi'i school, we will say playing chess is offensive and not sinful. Playing chess is offensive, but not sinful. So I'm playing chess, me and Arthur playing chess, and I've won twice, he's won twice, and we're like, yalla, fight one last one. So we're praying our fifth round, and we miss Dhuhr. So the Shafis will say, you forgot to pray Dhuhr, and so you should be forgiven because you forgot. But because the cause of the forgetfulness was this offensive action, and offense means prohibit, it means ignored, means Sharia doesn't accept it, then you do not have an accept. Your forgetfulness has been crossed out as invalid. So therefore, it doesn't count. You're considered sinful for missing the prayer, even though you did genuinely forget. Gargling while fasting. So gargling while you're fasting is offensive. You shouldn't do that. Okay, but accidentally drinking water is excused. So what if I'm gargling, which is offensive, and I accidentally swallow the water? Is that excused or not? According to the Shafi school, it's not. Why? Because you did something offensive. That's considered a prohibition. And so basically, even though you're not sinful for gargling, the Sharia said don't gargle. We do not accept it. It's not valid. We do not recognize it. So when you accidentally swallowed water, it's not excused. It's not excused. Right? You are considered to have intentionally broken your fast. Right? Praying after Fajr and Asr. So there's a debate among certain scholars. Is it haram or is it offensive to pray after Asr? So in the Shafi school itself, we have a debate. We call it al-awqat al-makruha, the offensive times. But yeah, it's sinful to pray after Asr in the Shafi school. So why do they call it the offensive times? So they say it is offensive to pray after Asr. And an act of worship that is nigh essentially offensive is invalid, meaning the Sharia does not accept it, as we mentioned. If it's prohibited, it's not accepted, it's not valid. And doing an act of worship that is not valid is sinful. So it's sinful either or. If you said it was haram to pray after Asr, it would be invalid and therefore sinful. If we said it was offensive, it would be haram and it would be invalid and therefore sinful. If we said it was sinful, if it was forbidden, prohibited categorically, then it would also be invalid and also be sinful. So either way, it's sinful. So here's a debate though. So I believe in the Maliki school, in certain scenarios, it is not actually sinful to pray after Asr, it is offensive. So here will be the debate. Here will be the high level debate. Is the offensive a subcategory of the permissible or a subcategory of the forbidden? And what I recall in Maliki legal methodology is they put it under the category of the permissible. The permissible is either permissible or offensive. Whereas we would say prohibited is either sinful or offensive, right? So the point is it's ignored. So that's another part of that discussion. Importantly then, again, we would say validity is not the same as acceptance. So going on Hajj with drug money is valid. Going on Hajj with drug money is not accepted. So on Yawm al-Qiyamah, you haven't gone on Hajj. In this life, you've gone on Hajj, fine. But on Yawm al-Qiyamah, you haven't gone on Hajj. Right? Praying with stolen wudu is valid. You have wudu. But does it wash away your sins? No, you're putting more sins on you. Right? And again, form versus the meaning. The structure and what are you actually doing? Right? What are you actually doing? So what is the point of zakat? The point of zakat is to pure your greed. Pure yourself of greed. Okay, well, what you're doing right now, is that actually what's happening or not? Right? And so we always have to remember that it has to be a form there. It has to be a structure. It has to be something. It can't exist as a kind of nebulous, flowery feeling that exists without any form. It doesn't work like that. There always has to be a form, but that we cannot overemphasize the form at the expense of the meaning. The two have to conjoin, and that's the answer basically as well to your questions, to Abid. All right, you can't separate the two. The form has to be there. There does have to be rights. Right? What are your rights? What are my rights? They do exist. But if it's a push-pull relationship, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So we have to have them for the court. We have to have them. Even in order to show ihsan, you have to know where your rights are. So for me to be kind to you, I have to know what my obligations are to begin with. Right? Because I'm trying to be nice to you, but I'm actually taking your rights because I don't even know where the rights are. Right? And so there has to be a bottom line, right? There has to be a bottom line that it's part of organizing society, organizing morality, organizing the court. We have to have a line that we're going to draw. What are my rights? What are your rights? They're there, but we can't forget the meaning, right? In Arabic, what is your spouse called? Your spouse is called the pair. You are one of a pair, right? And so, this is how, we see countless, how the Prophet was with his wives, etc. It's not like that. Right? It's not like that. But unfortunately, we're not all married to the Prophet at the same time, right? This is a kind of argument by some women as well. That's because the Prophet was like that. Yeah, I know, but we're not all married to the Prophet, right? And so certain rights still apply, right? And there are, importantly, before we come to it, there are fundamental differences in our paradigm as Muslims versus Disney World versus Western liberalism versus there are fundamental differences, and we have to acknowledge them, play with them, weigh them up, and judge them. We cannot say we are the same as this or the same as that. We are not. It's not the same, full stop. Okay, so that was acts of worship. So another thing about spoilers we're going over, as we like to do every week, acts of worship. So notabina, worship is not the most of fiqh. So unfortunately, many people do that. They want to study fiqh. So what do? They say, we're going to go and study wudu and prayer. Wudu and prayer. Wudu. That's not what you study in fiqh. If you pick up a major source of fiqh, the whole Hajj and all these different things, these are just, these are minor discussions. This is like 1/30th. No, sorry, yeah, not 1/30th. A 30% or 25% or 20% of what we talk about in fiqh is wudu and prayer and Hajj and stuff like that. It's not the main discussions. Most of what we talk about is financial transactions, court cases, these kind of things that we talk about in fiqh. Okay, so again, apologize, I'm going over time, but what can I do? So the form, so every single act of worship has a form. It has preconditions, for example, wudu, entering into ihram, for example, has integrals, fundamental parts that have to be there, without which it doesn't count. It may or may not have obligations. They might be separate to the integrals, it might be the same thing, right? So there might be something that depending on the madhab, depending on this discussion, it might be something you have to do, but it's not integral to the action, meaning the thing would exist without it, but you'd be sinful. For example, not going to Mina is an obligation of Hajj, but not an integral of Hajj. There are invalidators, things that would annul, right? Annul that form of that act of worship. There are often main supererogatory rituals, main sunnahs, and then there's extras, right? And often there might be something, for example, offensive things in action as well, right? So conditions, for example, of prayer, having wudu, covering your awrah, etc. Integrals of the prayer, saying the takbir, reciting the Quran, doing ruku', sujood, etc. Obligations, for example, reciting the Fatiha, pausing in ruku', these kind of things. Invalidators, breaking your wudu, etc. Right? Main sunnah, saying Subhan Rabbil Azim, these kind of things. Extras, many du'as that you can do, for example, right? Okay, so in prayer, what do we discuss? Again, this is just kind of the details. We discuss puberty. How do you reach puberty? How do you not reach puberty? Because I'm trying to understand who has to pray, who doesn't have to pray. Purity, we're talking about wudu, what you can and can't do with or without wudu. The prayer itself, the salah, what are its integrals, what are its conditions, what are this, what is that. We talk about, for example, the prostration of thanks, right? The forgetfulness prostration that comes in the prayer when you make mistakes. Prostrations of recital, right? These are all things we study in the bab of salah, for example. Prayer times, of course, joining and shortening prayers, repercussions of abandoning the prayer. What would happen if I didn't pray on a legal level, right? Is it considered excommunication? Do I leave Islam by not praying? What are the repercussions? Am I still a Muslim? If I am a Muslim and I die, am I buried with Muslims? I'm not buried with Muslims. How does it work, right? These are some of the discussions we talk about in prayer. Supererogative prayers, what are the various supererogative prayers? How would you pray them, etc. Funeral prayer, Salat al-Istisqa, rain prayer, etc. Other things like that. In zakat, we talk about who has to pay. So, for example, everyone would agree that non-Muslims have to pay zakat. Okay, what if a child? Does a child have to pay zakat? Right? What is zakatable wealth? What do we even pay zakat on? Is it on any wealth? Is it on a salary? Is it on gold? Is it only on silver? What is it? What is zakat minimum, etc.? Who can collect it? Certain different types of zakat, according to different madhabs, can only be collected by certain people, right? And only distributed by certain people. So who is it distributed to? So what is the definition of a poor person? What's the definition of a traveler? What is the definition of a debtor, etc.? And zakat al-fitr, what is the difference between zakat al-fitr that we pay on Eid versus zakat, normal zakat? Who do we pay it for? How much is it? What are the conditions of obligation, etc.? When does it have to be paid? Could it ever be delayed? These kind of things is what we talk about in zakat. Fasting, we talk about who has to fast, right? How to know when to fast, for example, moon sighting or that discussion. What breaks the fast, what doesn't break the fast, expiations for intentionally breaking the fast, etc. Right? And some other details as well. Usually along with, could talk about Ramadan as well, so i'tikaf, spiritual retreat. Where could you do spiritual retreat? Could you do it at home in a designated area, or does it have to be a mosque? How does it have to do it? Do you have to fast while you're doing it? Does it have to be a whole day, or is it going to be just a few moments? What if you vowed certain details about it? Do you have to fulfill those things? What would happen if you didn't? All of these things we talk about in i'tikaf, spiritual retreat. On Hajj, we talk about who has to go, who's obliged to go, the safety of the trip, right? Particularly if you think about most of history, people had to travel very huge distances, go by ship. You're obliged to go by ship if you have a 50-50 chance of surviving, etc. Would you have to go on Hajj in Corona, for example? Is Corona, is that still an obligation or not, right? Pilgrim sanctity, what is pilgrim sanctity? How do you enter into it? What happens when you enter into pilgrim sanctity? What is forbidden in that scenario? The rites of Hajj itself, the times of those things, how it's done, etc. When you excuse from some of these things. Expiations as well, for those rites, that's kind of part of it as well. Slaughtering on Hajj, etc. What do you do? How do you get out of pilgrim sanctity if you can't fulfill your Hajj? We talk about these things. And the lesser Hajj, the Umrah, right? And then along with Hajj, we might talk about things on Eid. So what is Eid? The takbirat on Eid, slaughtering on Eid. And then in the tangent of the tangent on slaughtering, you might talk about aqiqah, slaughtering for when a baby's born, the rights of, names of children, right? You might find it, depending on books of fiqh, you might find it organized in different ways. Okay, so these are the things we talk about, right? This is what things we talk about in ibadat. So we've looked at the concept of form and meaning, key principles and concepts, concept of the purity as a general picture, prayer in a general picture, zakat in a very general picture, fasting, and Hajj. Do we have any questions? Sorry, that bit of a marathon today. So jazakum khair everybody for staying here and surviving.
I have a quick question here.
Go ahead, Atif.
Let's read one.
Yeah, this is Brother Ridwan here. I just have a quick question about the Friday prayer. I believe for Shafi'i, you need to have like 40 men in order for you
40
to
residents, yeah, 40 residents, yeah.
Yeah, 40 residents. So in this kind, I'm not sure in this Corona time, what was the situation for those?
Allahu A'lam, from what I understand, I remember this discussion came up in Jordan, You know, so when I was in Jordan when it like I just came here to America, so the issue came up was, so originally what happened was they had a complete lockdown. All the mosques were closed. Okay, so it's sinful. The government has banned it. You cannot go to the mosque. All mosques are closed. Everyone's staying at home, etc. And then when things were under control, a bit more like things are in America, they allowed people to go to Jummah. So then the question is, given that I'm allowed to go to Jummah, do I have to go to Jummah? Right? And the answer is that if you're in an area where there are at least 40 men, excuse me, and you are not high risk, nor are the family members that you live with high risk, then you have to go. Right? But if you are high risk, given your age, given whatever, other issues, or you live with people, then you're going to be excused because it's dangerous, right? It's a genuine danger to you or to the people you live with. Right. And so with 40, if you can't get 40, again, I haven't seen, I don't know, I'm not super familiar with all the mosques here, but you should still go anyway. Like personally, where I lived in England, where I grew up in England, we didn't have 40 mosques in the city anyway. You didn't have 40, you had like 8 Muslims in our city anyway. So I would always go and pray. I would always, go from my high school, go down, we would pray in a Bengali restaurant, and we would pray there. And then I just pray dhuhr as well. So that's the best thing to do. So in a scenario where you are not excused, you should go and pray anyway, even if there's not 40 men, and pray dhuhr as well.
Okay, thank you.
Where are you from, Rizwan?
I am from Malaysia originally.
Apa kabar?
Yeah.
That's all I know. Orangutan. That's all I know. Apa kabar and orangutan. Everybody knows orangutan.
Yeah.
So I'll
thank
take
you.
a question.
Shukran.
Altif, you had a question?
No, I don't have a question.
Sister Abba, did you have a question?
No, thank you very much for answering my question. Thank you.
Sister Fahima, Musa, Tariq.
Good, Sadaq. Thank you.
Jazakum khair for surviving this class. It's quite long, quite heavy. I remember last semester, or last time, brother Imad was telling me, keep it 20 minutes, keep it short. This is an hour and a half of, alhamdulillah, boring English people talking. Alhamdulillah. So mashallah, may Allah reward you for not falling asleep.
No, it's not at all. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum.